History remembers kings for their power, their victories, and sometimes for their cruelty. But Baldwin IV of Jerusalem is remembered for something far greater. Despite suffering from one of the most feared diseases of the Middle Ages, leprosy, he became a warrior king who stood against Saladin, one of the greatest military leaders of all time. His story is not just about battles, but about courage, resilience, and respect, even from his enemies. This is the remarkable tale of the Leper King. In the late 12th century, the city of Jerusalem stood like a jewel between worlds. Its walls of pale limestone caught the sun each morning and glowed softly in the light of evening. The city was not large by the standards of the age, but its name was known from the cold shores of the Baltic to the deserts of Arabia. To Christians, it was the site of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection. To Muslims, it was the place from which the Prophet Muhammad was believed to have ascended to heaven. To Jews, it was the ancient seat of their temple and the holiest city on earth. By the 160s, the Kingdom of Jerusalem was a fragile realm, carved from the land during the First Crusade less than a century earlier. Its kings and nobles were Frankish Christians, most of them descended from warriors who had come from France, Italy, or Flanders. Yet the land they ruled was home to many peoples: Arabs and Armenians, Syriac Christians, Greek Orthodox believers, Bedouin tribes, Jews, and Muslims. The streets of the city carried the sound of many languages, the scent of many kitchens, and the rhythm of many prayers. But for all its beauty, Jerusalem was never at peace for long. Its wealth and sacred importance made it the focus of constant attention. From the Ayyubid sultans in Egypt and Syria, from rival Crusader states to the north, and from the distant kings of Europe who dreamed of glory in the east. Wars flared and faded like desert winds. Armies came and went. The walls of Jerusalem had seen both triumph and disaster. It was into this city, in the year 1161, that a boy named Baldwin was born. His father, Amalek I, was a seasoned warrior and a cautious ruler. His mother, Agnes of Courtenay, came from a noble family with its own complicated history. No one could have guessed then that their son would one day become known across Christendom and the Islamic world as the Leper King. In these years, life in Jerusalem moved in a delicate balance. The Crusader kingdom had its victories, but it also faced a new and rising power, a commander named Saladin, whose skill in war and diplomacy was bringing Egypt and Syria together under one banner. Tension lingered in the air, though many pretended not to notice. Traders still haggled in the market, monks still walked in slow processions, and nobles still hunted in the green valleys west of the city. But everyone, in some quiet place of the heart, knew that this peace was only borrowed time. Far from the intrigues of the court, the young Baldwin's earliest days were like those of any noble child in the Holy Land. He was cared for by nurses, taught to read Latin and French by priests, and played in the courtyards where olive trees gave shade from the sun. From the palace towers, he could look down over the clustered roofs of the city and beyond to the shimmering, distant desert. No one yet saw the shadow that would fall across his life. No one could imagine that the boy who ran through those stone holes would one day ride into battle with his body weakened by illness, yet still command the loyalty of knights and lords and stand face to face with the most formidable enemy of his age. The story of Baldwin IV is one of paradox, a king whose body was fragile, yet whose spirit was unbreakable, a ruler who could not escape his disease, yet never allowed it to define him. To understand his journey, we must begin here, in Jerusalem, the city between worlds, in the final years of what seemed, to many, an age of light. The year was 1161. In the palace of Jerusalem, within walls thick enough to keep out both summer heat and winter wind, a son was born to King Amalric I and Agnes of Courtenay. The birth itself was not recorded in detail by chroniclers. Such events were common in royal households. But we know the child was named Baldwin, after a line of earlier kings who had ruled the city since the First Crusade. His father, Amalric, was not yet king when Baldwin was born. At that time, Amalric held the title of Count of Jaffa and Ascalon, ruling coastal lands south of the city. These territories, with their harbors and fertile plains, were vital to the kingdom's survival. Baldwin's mother, Agnes, came from the Courtenay family, whose fortunes had risen and fallen in the shifting politics of the Crusader states. Her marriage to Amalric was politically useful, but also complicated, for the two were related by blood, a matter that later required a special ruling from the church. Baldwin's earliest home may not have been within the walls of Jerusalem itself, but rather in the seaside stronghold of Ascalon, or in the greener hills near Jaffa. Chroniclers tell us little of these first years, but the landscapes of his childhood would have been filled with contrasts. The deep blue of the Mediterranean, the pale gold of the coastal sands, and the rolling fields where barley and wheat grew in the cool season. From the start, Baldwin was surrounded by people from many lands. His nursemaids may have spoken Armenian or Arabic. The knights of his father's household used French and Latin. The servants in the kitchens might have been local Christians speaking in the soft tones of Syriac. This mix of languages was the soundscape of his earliest memories, a hum of voices, each carrying a fragment of the world beyond the palace walls. As a child of the nobility, Baldwin's education began almost as soon as he could walk. He would have been taught to handle small wooden swords, to ride ponies under the guidance of squires, and to memorize prayers and psalms. By the age of 6 or 7, he was likely introduced to Latin, the language of the church, and to the chansons de geste, epic tales of Charlemagne's knights, which were as much moral lessons as they were entertainment. One detail preserved by William of Tyre, Baldwin's tutor, offers a rare glimpse into the boy's character. William described him as lively, intelligent, and unusually determined for his age. The young prince enjoyed rough play, climbing and riding, often with more energy than his companions. Yet William also noted something curious. Baldwin sometimes failed to notice when he was hurt. A bruise on his arm, a scratch on his hand, these drew no reaction from him. At first, no one thought much of it. This small observation, mentioned almost in passing, would later take on a grave significance. But for now, in these early years, Baldwin was simply a boy, one who raced through the palace gardens, listened to the distant crash of waves against the harbor walls, and watched the banners of arriving ships flutter in the wind. Life for the royal family was not without its shadows. The kingdom's borders were under constant pressure, and alliances shifted like sand in the desert wind. Amalric's duties often took him away from home, leading campaigns in Egypt or negotiating with neighboring powers. In his absence, Baldwin spent more time with his mother's family, the courtiers, and with trusted retainers who ensure that the prince's days were filled with lessons, games, and the rituals of the court. What Baldwin could not yet know was that these peaceful moments, the warm afternoons in the gardens, the quiet evenings in the chapel, were the foundation upon which he would one day draw strength. The resilience that defined his reign was not born on the battlefield. It began here, in the innocence of his childhood, in a world where duty, faith, and heritage were already shaping the path ahead. It began with something so small that it might have passed unnoticed in another child. Baldwin was around 9 years old when his tutor, William of Tyre, first recognized that there was something unusual. One afternoon, while the boys of the royal household played in the courtyard, Baldwin wrestled with another child and fell hard against the stones. The others winced at the impact, expecting a cry of pain, but Baldwin simply laughed and continued the game. Later, William saw that the boy's arm was badly scraped, yet Baldwin seemed unaware of it. At first, this seemed a curious blessing. A prince who did not flinch from pain might grow into a fearless knight. But William, a man of learning who had studied both theology and the medical knowledge of the time, felt a quiet unease. He tested the boy, pressing the skin of his hands and forearms with a blunt object, even pricking him lightly. Baldwin showed no reaction. The sensation of touch seemed dulled, as though his body was whispering instead of speaking. In the 12th century, medicine in the Latin West was limited, though in the East, it was far more advanced. William may have heard of such symptoms before, perhaps from Arab physicians whose writings had reached the libraries of the Crusade states. He might have known of leprosy, a disease feared not only for its physical effects, but for the deep social isolation it brought. Yet to name such an illness in a royal child would have been unthinkable without certainty. No public announcement was made. The court continued as before. Baldwin's lessons, his riding, his prayers, all went on unchanged. But privately, those close to him began to watch. His mother, Agnes, perhaps noticed the way he sometimes gripped a cup too tightly, unaware of the pressure in his fingers. A servant might have observed that he could hold his hand over a candle's warmth longer than any other boy. It is here, in these years, that one of the lesser-known aspects of Baldwin's life emerges. Some chroniclers hint that he was taken, quietly, to see physicians from beyond the Latin world, perhaps even Muslim or Jewish doctors in Jerusalem who had access to medical texts from Greece, Persia, and India. If so, the diagnosis may have been whispered only among a trusted few. In an age when disease could be seen as divine punishment, revealing such news about a prince was dangerous. Yet Baldwin, still a child, was unaware of the shadow forming over his life. If he noticed that adults sometimes exchanged glances when he failed to feel pain, he did not speak of it. His days were still filled with the rhythm of noble training, learning to command a horse, practicing with wooden swords, memorizing the histories of his kingdom. He loved tales of great rulers and battles, but he also showed a curiosity for the world beyond war, for the customs of distant lands, for the way the sea changed color in different seasons. There is an image, preserved in the writings of a later chronicler, of Baldwin standing at the palace balcony at dusk, looking west toward the sea. Ships from Genoa, Venice, and Marseille would enter the harbor, their sails catching the last light. For Baldwin, the world seemed vast and open, filled with possibilities. But in the private corridors of power, some already wondered, could this boy, whose body betrayed him in such a strange way, one day rule a kingdom that lived by the sword? The illness was slow. There was no sudden decline, no dramatic moment when everything changed. Instead, it crept forward quietly, marking Baldwin in ways invisible to most. It would be years before the truth became undeniable, years in which he would grow not only in stature, but in the qualities that would define him: patience, resolve, and an unshakable sense of duty. By the time Baldwin reached his early teens, the outlines of his future were becoming clearer, though not in the way anyone had imagined at his birth. His father, King Amalric I, was often absent, engaged in campaigns in Egypt or negotiations with neighboring rulers. Baldwin was left in the care of tutors, knights, and his mother's influential relatives, the courtenay. The education of a young noble in the Kingdom of Jerusalem was a careful balance of mind and body. Baldwin's mornings began with prayer in the palace chapel, where the cool stone walls echoed with the chanting of Latin songs. From there, he moved to lessons in reading and writing, both in Latin and Old French, the language of court and chivalry. He learned the legal codes of the kingdom, the complex agreements that bound vassals to their lords, and the history of the Crusades, not as distant legend, but is the very foundation of his family's claim to rule. In the afternoons, Baldwin trained in the arts of war. The sandy parade grounds outside Jerusalem's walls rang with the clash of wooden swords and the thud of practice lances against padded targets. Yet here his illness began to make itself known in subtle ways. His grip on the sword hilt sometimes lacked precision. He could ride for hours without complaining of saddle sores that would have left another boy limping. To the casual observer, these seemed like signs of toughness, but those who knew his condition understood the truth. Despite this, Baldwin's determination was remarkable. One chronicler later wrote that he was more diligent in arms than any of his companions, as though he fought not only the enemy, but fate itself. He threw himself into archery, horseback drills, and mock skirmishes, unwilling to allow weakness to define him. It was during these years that Baldwin's political education deepened. He attended councils where seasoned lords debated alliances and borders. He listened to emissaries from Byzantium, the Italian city-states, and even Mysian rulers, absorbing the way each man used words as carefully as a knight used a sword. The Crusader kingdom was a fragile mosaic, surrounded by powerful enemies, yet sustained by trade, faith, and diplomacy. Brinning learned early that a ruler's strength lay not only in arms, but in the ability to keep many different factions moving in the same direction. One little-known episode from his youth reveals both his curiosity and his courage. During a royal progress to Acre, Baldwin reportedly slipped away from the formal procession to speak with a group of merchants at the harbor. They were unloading spices, textiles, and carved ivory from ships that had come from as far as India. The young prince asked them about their journeys, their languages, and the lands they had seen. It was unusual for a royal child to mingle so freely with common traders, but Baldwin seemed fascinated by the wider world beyond the battlements of Jerusalem. By the mid-170s, events in the kingdom began to move quickly. Baldwin's older relatives were dying or losing influence, and the question of succession loomed larger. His father's health was uncertain, and Baldwin's own condition, though still concealed from the public, was advancing slowly. His hands occasionally trembled, and he began to lose some dexterity in his fingers. Yet when the moment came, Baldwin did not shrink from it. In 1174, King Amalric I died suddenly of dysentery while on campaign. Baldwin, barely 13 years old, was next in line. The nobles of the kingdom faced a dilemma. A boy king, already touched by a disease feared across Christendom, would soon sit upon the throne of Jerusalem. The coronation would not be delayed. Baldwin IV, the Leper King, was about to step into history. Baldwin IV was crowned in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in the autumn of 1174. The great basilica, built over the place where Christians believe Christian had been crucified and resurrected, was heavy with incense. Candles flickered against the gilded icons as bishops intoned the Latin rite. The boy, barely 13, stood before the altar wearing a crown too large for his thin frame. His face was pale but composed. In his eyes, chroniclers noted, there was no trace of fear. The reality behind the ceremony, however, was far more complicated. A child could not rule alone, and the kingdom was immediately divided over who would serve as regent. Two powerful figures emerged: Count Raymond III of Tripoli, a shrewd and cautious leader, and Miles of Plancy, the constable of the kingdom, known for his ambition. This struggle for control unfolded quietly at first, but the tension was palpable. Raymond had a distant blood claim to the throne and saw himself as the kingdom's natural protector. Miles, on the other hand, relied on his position at court and his network of allies in Jerusalem. Baldwin, though young, was not blind to their rivalry. He listened carefully, rarely speaking in council, but storing away each argument and each maneuver. Even then, he seemed to understand that a king's survival often depended on knowing when to stay silent. One lesser-known aspect of Baldwin's early reign was his reliance on William of Tyre, the same man who had once discovered his illness. William was now Archbishop of Tyre and served as both royal chancellor and trusted advisor. It was William who ensured that Baldwin's education and statecraft continued, even as the regent handled the affairs of the realm. Zephyros was a slave. Zephyros were clear of a powerful sign, how letters of diplomacy were sealed, and how information flowed through a network of envoys, spies, and merchants. The boy king's first major challenge came from without, not within. In the years before Baldwin's coronation, a new Muslim leader had risen to power in Egypt and Syria, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known in the West as Saladin. Though not yet at the height of his power, Saladin was already consolidating his forces, uniting territories that had once been fractured. For the Kingdom of Jerusalem, this was a threat unlike any before, a single, disciplined enemy with vast resources and a clear vision. In 1174, as Baldwin's coronation was still fresh in memory, Saladin moved against the Crusader-held city of Damascus, further expanding his influence. The regent Raymond counseled caution. The kingdom was not ready for war under a child king. But Baldwin's court also contained men who argued for bold action, fearing that delay would only strengthen Saladin's hand. One event from this period, rarely mentioned in popular accounts, reveals Baldwin's growing political awareness. According to an obscure chronicle preserved in the archives of Acre, Baldwin quietly met with a group of Italian merchants who had sailed into the port of Tyre. They brought news not only of trade, but of shifting alliances in Europe. Baldwin listened as they spoke of Emperor Frederick Barbarossa's disputes in Germany, the rivalries among the Italian city-states, and the possibility, however slim, of securing new aid from the West. The boy asked precise questions about sea routes, cargoes, and the loyalty of certain ports. This was not the curiosity of a child, it was the calculating mind of a ruler measuring the chessboard. Meanwhile, within the court, Baldwin's illness was still hidden from the general population. Only his closest attendants knew that he could no longer feel certain parts of his body, that sometimes he needed help fastening his armor, or that he avoided long periods of standing because of numbness in his legs. The secrecy was absolute. A whisper of leprosy could undermine his authority before it had even begun to solidify. By the end of his first year as king, Baldwin had begun to assert himself more directly in council meetings. He rarely overruled his regent, but when he did, it was with precision, choosing battles that mattered. He understood, perhaps instinctively, that his youth could be used as a shield. While others underestimated him, he was learning, preparing for the day when the crown would truly be his to bear. That day would come sooner than anyone expected. By 1176, Baldwin IV was barely 15 years old, still a boy by the reckoning of most courts in Europe. Yet the fate of the Crusader kingdom was drawing him toward the battlefield. Saladin's forces had been testing the kingdom's borders with a series of raids, probing for weaknesses. The regent, Count Raymond of Tripoli, preferred to remain cautious, fortifying strongholds and conserving resources. But Baldwin had heard enough reports from scouts and pilgrims to understand a dangerous truth. Saladin's movements were not random. He was positioning for a decisive strike. Baldwin summoned his council in Jerusalem. The boy king sat at the head of the table, his hands resting on the polished wood, hands that he could barely feel. The Templar master Odo of Saint-Amand argued for meeting Saladin in the field. The Hospitaller commander urged caution. The young monarch listened without interrupting, then surprised the chamber. "I will lead the host myself," Let them see the King of Jerusalem rides against them." For some lords, the words were a shock. Others, who doubted his strength, saw it as dangerous bravado. But Baldwin understood politics as much as warfare. His illness was still a secret closely guarded, yet rumors had begun to seep through the ports and markets. A king who could not ride or fight would lose the loyalty of his knights. The call to arms spread quickly. By mid-November, banners of Jerusalem, Tripoli, and the military orders gathered at the fortress of Ibelin. Italian crossbowmen from Pisa joined them, along with Armenian auxiliaries and a contingent of desert scouts who knew every dry wadi and hidden well. One fragmentary account from an archive in Tyre notes that Baldwin insisted on inspecting each company personally, greeting even the lowliest spearmen. To the men, this was not the image of a fragile boy. It was the presence of a true commander. The march toward Ramla was the winter sun was still harsh on the plains, and the cold nights bit deep into the bones. Chroniclers say Baldwin slept in a campaign tent like the rest of his men, but one lesser-known account describes how his attendants heated smooth stones in the fire and wrapped them in cloth to place at his feet, numbed from disease. Saladin advanced with an army at least twice the size of Baldwin's. Confident in his numbers, he moved slowly, believing the Franks would not dare to face him in open battle. But Baldwin, guided by the Templars, struck for the high ground near Montgisard. It was a bold choice. The element of surprise would be their only advantage. On the morning of the battle, Baldwin donned a plain surcoat over his mail, the golden cross of Jerusalem emblazoned on his chest. A Templar chaplain blessed the host, raising the true cross, the most sacred relic in the kingdom, before the soldiers. An obscure Hospitaller record claims that Baldwin, unable to grip the reins tightly, had them looped and fastened around his wrists. Yet, when he rode to the front, he looked every inch a king. The clash was fierce and chaotic. Saladin's vanguard, caught off guard, faltered under the weight of the Frankish charge. Templar lances punched through the lines. Crossbow bolts hissed over the heads of the cavalry. Baldwin, positioned at the center, pressed forward with the banner of the kingdom beside him. Chroniclers speak of the young king's unwavering composure, his pale face set like stone, his voice carrying commands over the din of combat. By day's end, Saladin's army was in retreat, abandoning much of its baggage and leaving the field strewn with banners, shields, and broken spears. Saladin himself narrowly escaped with a small guard. For Jerusalem, it was not merely a victory, it was a miracle. But victory came at a cost. Baldwin's attendants found him near collapse, his armor almost impossible to remove from stiffened limbs. That night, he refused a bed until every wounded man had been tended to and the dead given rites. His personal physician noted swelling in his joints and a fever that lasted several days, a reminder that while Baldwin could defeat Saladin on the field, he could not defeat the illness within. News of Montgisard traveled quickly to Europe. The Leper King, who had humbled the great Saladin, became both a legend and a curiosity. Letters to the West carefully painted him as a warrior, blessed by God. Hiding the harsher truth, Baldwin had won the day through brilliance and sheer willpower. But each victory would cost him more than the last. The victory at Montgisard had given Baldwin IV a precious gift: time. But peace in the Holy Land was never absolute. While Saladin regrouped in Egypt and Syria, the real danger began to grow within the walls of Jerusalem itself. The court of the Crusader kingdom was a mosaic of rival factions, native-born nobles who traced their lineage to the First Crusade, newly arrived knights from Europe seeking fortune, and the ever-watchful leaders of the military orders. Each group had its own vision for the kingdom's future, and the young king, now 16, stood at the center of their competing ambitions. The most persistent voice was Count Raymond III of Tripoli, Baldwin's cousin and former regent. A seasoned diplomat, Raymond believed that only a negotiated peace with Saladin could preserve Jerusalem. His rival, the ambitious Guy of Lusignan, a Poitevin noble with charm and a dangerous lack of military experience, argued for aggressive expansion, promising glory and wealth. Into this mix stepped the Queen Mother, Agnes of Courtenay, whose political instincts were as sharp as any knight's sword. Agnes, though officially divorced from Baldwin's father, retained influence at court and quietly supported the Lusignan faction. She saw in Guy a husband for her daughter Sibylla, and perhaps a way to secure her family's power beyond Baldwin's reign. Few chronicles mention it, but Baldwin's illness played directly into these intrigues. By now, his leprosy was advancing. He could still ride and command, but his physicians, the best Latin and Syrian doctors available, could not slow the disease. The king himself understood the unspoken question that lingered in every council meeting. What happens when Baldwin can no longer rule? One evening in early 1180, Baldwin summoned a small group of trusted advisors to a private audience in the Tower of David. The meeting was lit by oil lamps, their flames flickering against the fixed stone walls. Among those present were the Templar master Odo of Saint-Amand, Patriarch Heraclius of Jerusalem, and William of Tyre, the kingdom's chancellor and historian. According to a lesser-known passage in William's own chronicle, the conversation was tense. Baldwin spoke openly of his failing health and the need for a clear succession plan. Odo urged the king to secure a military alliance through marriage, specifically to wed Sibylla to a proven commander. Heraclius, however, leaned toward Guy, claiming that his ties to Western nobility could bring fresh crusading forces to the kingdom. What Baldwin did next startled the room. He agreed to Sibylla's marriage to Guy of Lusignan. Historians still debate whether this was the king's true will or the result of his mother's political maneuvering. Some evidence suggests Baldwin felt cornered, that opposing the Lusignan faction risked fracturing the nobility at a time when unity was paramount. The marriage took place swiftly, without the elaborate ceremonies typical of royal unions. Winning attended but remained silent through much of the celebration, his expression unreadable. In public, he embraced the role of a dutiful brother. In private, he began to test Guy's abilities, assigning him minor military commands. The results were disappointing and would have far-reaching consequences. Meanwhile, Saladin was watching. Through his network of spies and traders, he learned of the divisions at the Frankish court. Letters intercepted near Ascalon hint that the Sultan believed internal strife would achieve what open war could not, the slow unraveling of Jerusalem from within. For Baldwin, the challenge was now twofold. He had to keep Saladin at bay, while managing a court where loyalty shifted with the winds of ambition. In the coming years, these internal fractures would prove the great weapon: the south, the winds, all rain. The Leper King had won the Battle of Montgisard on the open field, but the war for the soul of his kingdom had just begun. By the early 180s, Baldwin IV was still in his 20s, young by the reckoning of kings, yet his body bore the marks of a lifetime's hardship. The leprosy that had first shown itself in his boyhood no longer hid behind gloves or long sleeves. The disease had claimed sensation in his hands, disfigured parts of his face, and left his joints swollen and stiff. In the medieval mind, leprosy carried a weight beyond its physical toll. It was feared not only as a wasting sickness, but as a possible sign of divine judgment. In Europe, many sufferers were cast out of their communities, made to wear bells to warn others of their approach. In Jerusalem, where pilgrims arrived from all corners of Christendom, attitudes were more complex. The city was home to the Hospital of St. Lazarus, where the Order of St. Lazarus, knights who themselves were lepers, tended to the afflicted and even took up arms when needed. Baldwin, though king, was not immune to whispers. Some courtiers avoided touching objects he had handled,
Others made the sign of the cross when he passed.
Yet, according to a fragment from an Armenian pilgrim's diary found in the archives of Cilicia, Baldwin often visited the Lazarite hospital in person, speaking with patients and asking about their needs. He reportedly told one of the brothers, "A king with this illness is no different from the poorest man in your ward, save for the weight of his crown." Physicians from both the Latin West and the Islamic world attended him, for Jerusalem in the 12th century was a crossroads of medical knowledge. The king's personal care included washes and infusions of cedarwood and myrtle, ointments of frankincense and honey, and, on the advice of a Syrian doctor, a diet meant to balance the humors, fresh figs, pomegranate juice, and boiled barley. None of it halted the disease, but some remedies eased the swelling and pain. Baldwin's illness forced changes in how he ruled. He could still ride, but not for long distances without rest. Military campaigns required that he travel in a covered litter between bursts of mounted command. His handwriting grew shaky, so trusted scribes recorded his orders. The king adapted with a strategist's mind. If he could not always lead from the saddle, he would lead from the council chamber, honing the kingdom's diplomacy and strengthening its network of castles. One little-known episode from 1183 reveals how illness and politics intertwined. When Saladin threatened the fortress of Kerak during the wedding feast of Baldwin's sister Isabella, the king, feverish and in pain, insisted on traveling to relieve the siege. Chronicler Ermel writes that Baldwin had to be lifted into the saddle by 2 knights, yet he commanded the army with enough authority that Saladin withdrew without a pitched battle. It was a victory of presence as much as arms. Still, the king was aware of the limits time was placing upon him. He began considering how to secure the kingdom's future after his death. This meant more than naming an heir. It meant reshaping alliances, ensuring that Jerusalem would not fracture the moment he was gone. But illness has its own politics. Every day Baldwin appeared in public was a statement of defiance, proof that the kingdom still had a living, ruling king. And every absence from view fueled speculation. Was the king dying? Would Guy of Lusignan soon take the throne? Would Saladin march on Jerusalem unopposed? By now, Baldwin had learned that ruling with leprosy meant ruling in the shadow of rumor as much as the shadow of illness. It was a battle fought without swords, where the enemy was time itself, and in that war, no man could claim an easy victory. In late 1183, the fortress of Kerak, a towering Crusader stronghold in the rugged hills of Moab, became the stage for one of the most unusual sieges in the history of the Latin kingdom. Kerak was more than a military asset. It was a symbol of Frankish control over the routes between Damascus, Mecca, and the Red Sea. And in that year, it was also the site of a royal wedding. Isabella, Baldwin IV's young half-sister, was to be wed to Humphrey IV of Toron. The halls of Kerak were festooned with banners, tapestries, and the smell of roasting meat. Nobles from across the kingdom gathered for the celebration. Even Saladin's family ties were tangled in the event. The bride's mother, Maria Comnena, was a Byzantine princess, and some guests had connections that crossed political lines. Yet as music played and wine flowed, Saladin's forces advanced.
Well, even the good-bad state isn't in their range.
Chronicler Enwal tells us that the Sultan's army surrounded Kerak so suddenly that many guests were trapped inside before they knew danger was near. From the wedding feast's high windows, guests could see the shimmer of enemy campfires encircling the castle. What followed has become legend. Maria Comnena sent word to Saladin, reminding him that one wing of the castle housed the wedding guests. Saladin, chivalrous in this instance, ordered his siege engines not to target that section, a courtesy rare in medieval warfare. Still, the rest of Kerak came under relentless bombardment. Stones hurled by mangonels crashed into the outer walls, the air filled with the groan of timber, and the cries of defenders. Inside, the situation grew desperate. The castle's systems held enough water, but food was another matter. Kitchens rationed bread and meat, and the wedding feast quickly turned from celebration to survival. Isabella herself is said to have moved among the wounded, bringing water and comfort, an image preserved in an obscure Armenian chronicle housed in Echmiadzin, which praises her courage as though she were queen already. News of the siege reached Jerusalem in a matter of days. Baldwin IV, though weakened by fever and pain, resolved to lead the relief force himself. He ordered the mustering of knights from across the kingdom, summoning both the Templars and the Hospitallers. His arrival at the head of the army, wrapped in heavy cloaks against the desert chill, was a moment that burned itself into the memory of those present. A knight from Champagne later wrote that the king rode like one returning from the grave, yet with the gaze of a lion. Saladin, confronted with the sudden approach of Baldwin's army, made a calculated decision. Rather than risk a pitched battle against a king whose reputation at Montgisard still inspired fear, the Sultan withdrew. A siege was lifted before winter could trap his forces in the mountains. Baldwin entered Kerak not as a guest, but as a savior. The wedding, interrupted yet not destroyed, was completed with renewed fervor. Still, the incident underscored the precariousness of the kingdom's position. Saladin had shown he could strike deep into Crusader territory, and only swift mobilization had saved Kerak. Less well known is what happened in the days after the siege. According to a marginal note in one manuscript of William of Tyre's chronicle, Baldwin met privately with Maria Comnena and Isabella. He spoke not only of gratitude but of politics, urging Isabella and Humphrey to remain loyal to the crown above all other factions. This was the king's way of shoring up unity in a kingdom he knew could fracture at any moment. Kerak had been saved, but Baldwin understood a truth that few dared speak aloud. Next time, the Sultan might not show such mercy, and the kingdom might not be able to gather its strength in time. By 1184, Baldwin IV's body was a battlefield. The physicians could not win. His eyesight was fading, his hands could barely hold a sword, and he often needed to be carried into the council chamber. Yet, the kingdom still faced dangers that demanded a king's presence. Saladin's power was growing, his armies testing the borders like waves wearing a waystone. Baldwin's final active campaign came that same year, in what chroniclers call the Slow War, a series of defensive maneuvers to protect the kingdom's frontiers without committing to a battle that could destroy Jerusalem's army. It was a war of movement, not grand clashes. Scouts reported enemy raids near the Jordan Valley. Baldwin responded by riding, or being carried, to key fortresses, ensuring supplies were stockpiled and garrison reinforced. One rare account from an anonymous Hospitaller letter describes Baldwin inspecting the defenses of the castle at Bethany. The writer notes that the king touched the stones with hands that felt nothing, yet his eyes saw the weakness in the wall. The Leper King could not feel pain in his limbs, but he could still read the language of fortification like a scholar reads a manuscript. By late 1184, Baldwin knew he had to settle the matter of succession. Guy of Lusignan, his brother-in-law, had lost the king's trust after perceived failures in leadership. Instead, Baldwin crowned his 5-year-old nephew, Baldwin V, as co-king, hoping to secure a smoother transition. The ceremony was held in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, its incense masking the scent of illness. Some said the moment had the air of a funeral as much as a coronation. Even as his strength waned, Baldwin refused total retreat from public life. In early 1185, he made what would be his last significant journey, visiting the Hospital of St. Lazarus. Witnesses recalled the striking scene: the king, pale and gaunt, moving among the leper knights, some of whom were in worse condition than he. A fragment from the Chronicle of Anole records him telling them, "We fight the same enemy, not the Saracen, but the despair that would have us lay down our arms." By March of 1185, Baldwin could no longer leave his chambers. The city outside his windows prepared for Easter, but inside the royal palace the air was heavy with the knowledge that the kingdom was about to lose the one ruler who had consistently held Saladin at bay. The end came quietly, surrounded by priests and a few loyal nobles. Baldwin IV received the last rites. Arnoul says the king's final act was to raise his hand, the gesture stiff, the fingers twisted, in a blessing over the city. Whether this was conscious or the spasm of a dying body, no one could say for certain. He was buried in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, near the tomb of Godfrey of Bouillon. There was no great procession. The streets were too tense, the political future too uncertain. But for those who had served under him, Baldwin's passing marked the end of an age, the age of a king who, though ravaged by illness, had stood unbroken against one of the greatest commanders of the medieval world. In the years that followed, Jerusalem would fall to Saladin. Chroniclers, looking back, would point to Baldwin's reign as the last moment when the Crusader kingdom stood on equal footing with its enemy. His leprosy had stolen his body, but not his will, and for as long as he lived, the walls of Jerusalem held. When Baldwin IV died, the kingdom of Jerusalem lost more than a king. It lost its shield. Within just 4 years, Saladin would march through the same gates Baldwin had sworn to defend. The city's walls still stood, but without the Leper King, they were only stone. History remembers the disease before the man. But Baldwin's life was proof that leadership isn't measured in strength of body, but in strength of will. He faced every dawn, knowing his time was running out, and still, he chose to ride to war. Maybe that's why, centuries later, even his enemies spoke of him with respect. Saladin himself is said to have called him a king without equal in our time. In the end, Baldwin IV's story isn't just about the Crusades. It's about the fight to hold your ground when the world tells you to surrender. And maybe, just maybe, it's about the price a man will pay to keep his people safe, even when he knows he won't be there to see the victory.